Stay tuned to get everything new. Have a nice time. Goodbye. الكويزات ده عشان هبدأ خلاص. وطي التلفزيون. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. Hello there. Hope you are doing well. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. هل في أي مشاكل في الصوت يا جماعة؟ In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. الصوت واضح يا شباب؟ كله كويس؟ اوكي. كل عام وحضراتكم بخير. ربنا يعيد علينا وعليكم الأيام بخير يا رب. كل سنة وانتم طيبين. I'd like, first of all, before going on our academic lectures and the different types of literary criticism, make a quick revision for what we actually started. Okay? So, first of all, I'd like to guess how do you do with definitions of literary criticism, how are they varied, and what are the reason behind these variation or variety of definitions. By the end of this lecture, inshallah, student will be acquainted with the following points. Okay. Number one, literary criticism definitions. Okay. Number two, are they varied? Number three, changing role of literary criticism. I know that all these points we have discussed, okay, but this is a quick revision to make a sort of connections between the previous lessons and the current lessons, okay. Also, we'll be acquainted with following points: literary criticism. Oh, yes, definition, we did that. Why are they varied? We did that. Changing role of literary critic. Also, we shall have a look on literary criticism and its essential meaning. What's the essential meaning of a literary criticism? What are the principles of literary criticism? And the qualifications of a literary critic. Okay? Well, so as I told you, all this is nothing but a quick revision for what we actually studied in our academic lectures. Okay? So, in a quick revision, to make a sort of connections between what we actually talk and what we are going to have next. So criticism is a play of the mind on the aesthetic qualities of literature, having for its object an interpretation of literary value. Atkins. By the way, in the MCQ questions, you might have a question like, for example, who is the that definition belongs to, for example, to whom this definition belongs to. For example, if I have Addison, Atkins, Victor Hugo, Walter Beta, or any other scientists. So I could have a question like this. So by whom is this definition? Or for whom this definition is recognized or could be attributed to. Okay? As I told you before about this definition, this particular definitions focuses upon the idea that the literary criticism is a mental activity. So it is a play of the mind, and it is some sort of game rather than some sort of rigid work or uncreative work. So it's a play of the mind and the mental activity, as I told you, and that mental activity would be focused on a specific elements of literature, which is supposed to be the aesthetic elements. What's the meaning of aesthetic elements? Aesthetic elements means the artistic elements, the beautiful, the impleasured elements of literature. Okay, that's it. Of course, I won't go and explaining all these definitions once again, but in a quick revision, as I told you before. Okay, so of course, if you have any question, please write it in the chat box. Okay, if you have any question, write it in the chat box, and I'll check him every now and then. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, chat. الناس اللي بتسأل المحاضرة دي أصلا تخصص نقد أدبي لغات وترجمة، مش علوم يا جماعة. علوم يوم الخميس الساعة 9، مش دلوقتي. أوكي، عشان لو في حد بيسأل من الجماعة اللي هما بيقول هل دي المحاضرة، لا طبعا مش لعلوم. أوكي، مش لعلوم بنات، خلاص، مش بتاعة مختبرات ولا تحاليل ولا الكلام ده. أوكي، thank you very much. This is المحاضرة دي أصلا تخصص نقد أدبي. okay؟ مش تبعكم انتوا خالص. thank you very much. محاضرة تخصص نقد أدبي، والعنوان مكتوب فوق Academic English Literary Criticism. okay? thank you very much. So, as I told you, this definition is mainly concerned with the aesthetic elements or aesthetic qualities of literature, as I told you before, and that game or that mental activity of literary criticism having for its object an interpretation of literary value. And as I told you, the value, particularly or specifically when it is a literary value, this means that literature itself has certain values, and values are a set of beliefs, little in number, few in number, core in nature, and very difficult to change. As you say, literature itself has certain beliefs, strong beliefs, and values. These values should be taken care of when a literary work go on in interpreting a given work or a given piece of literature. That's it. Another definition of literary criticism. Criticism is the exercise of judgment, as I told you. I told you before that literary criticism primarily means judgment. From the Greek word critic, which means judgment, but it's not so simply that I pronounce a sort of judgment haphazardly. Not, of course, because everything has its principles, rules, and canon. So here, this definition of the previous one is mainly concerned with the practice of judgment, the idea of judgment. So now we have the practice of judgment in the province of art and literature. And as I see, we have wider scope rather than literature. So the previous one mainly concerned with literature. Now we have the scope of the practice of that judgment is wider or get wider. Why? Because we have art and literature. And the critic here is a person. It's supposed to be a person who is possessed of, and as I said possessed of متلبس بيه. يعني معناها ان لازم المعرفة بتكون بتاعت literary criticism يعني وثيقة الصلة بيه. Possessed of متلبس بتلك المعرفة knowledge necessary to enable them to pronounce the right judgment. Okay, so this knowledge is necessary for them to pronounce that good or right judgment upon the merit or the worth. Of course, this is an important point. The merit or the worth, which is the advantage of a given work, such work as come within this province. Very good. Said. Now this definition highlights the idea of the nature of the practice itself as a judgment or pronouncing judgment, as well as the work of a literary critic. What else? Another definition of literary criticism: the true critic will dwell on excellences rather than imperfections. This is Addison. So this definition by Addison. As you see, any given literary work should have what's known as merits and demerits, advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so the true critic, according to Addison, shall or will dwell on the excellences of a given literary work rather than imperfections. That's to say, not to be considered literary criticism, not to be considered as a fault-finding process. So unlike what comes to your mind, what initially comes to your mind when you listen to the word literary criticism, you mean that you are going to criticize someone by telling the bad things about him or about his work. Of course not. Now he tells you that a literary critic is supposed to tell you about the good things of literature rather than the bad things. Okay, so it's a good idea. Okay, another definition is a wholly mistake the nature of a criticism who think the business of is principally its business is principally to find fault. As I told you now, I have just told you now, literary criticism is not a fault finding process. Actually, in its essential meaning, literary criticism is a sort of pronouncing judgment, and the judgment is rather to tell the excellences of a given work rather than imperfections. So now this definition highlights the idea that literary criticism is not a fault-finding process, and those who believe that are mistaken. Okay, so they wholly mistaken the mistake the nature of criticism who think its business is principally to find fault. Why? Criticism, as it was first initiated by Aristotle, was meant to be standard for judging well. So the essential meaning of literary criticism, as it's initially laid down by Aristotle, is supposed to be a standard for judging well. And of course, that standard had the chiefest part of which the main business of that standard as to observe those excellences which should delight a reasonable reader. As you say, that standard should gauge, should assess, should evaluate those excellences which are supposed to delight, should delight the reasonable reader. Very good. As I said, once again, we have the role of the mental activities in that practice of judgment. That's it. Another definition, the true critic will dwell on excellences rather than imperfections. We have this is repeated, by the way. This is, I think, that we have in Addison repeated. Okay, this is it. Another definition, is the work good or bad? That's the domain of critic, or that's the critic's domain. As you know, the word domains mean here a field of study. So it's a field of work, field of practice, the field of study. So here he says that the field of study, or the fields of work for a good literary critic, this is the good work. So once again, it's exactly like Addison's definition when he said that the true critic dwells or shall or will dwell on the excellences rather than imperfection. So now here for Victor Hugo, we have the same point of view. So we have him say that the work, is the work good or bad? Of course, according to what? Is the work good or bad according to these literary principles? Okay, not according to any other different criteria. That's it. So is the work good or bad? That's the critic's domain. So this is the field of study or of work for the critic. This is the definition made by Victor Hugo. If you remember, we have many other definitions, like, of course, I don't have the time or enough time to make it in the presentation, but if you remember, I told you about the definition of I.A. Richard when we said that according to I.A. Richard, to set up as a critic is to set up as a judge of value, if you remember. So this is the definition of I.A. Richard. To set up as a critic is to set up as a judge of value. And if you remember, when we have said in the first definition, having for its object or its objective to interpret the literary value. Now, if you are assuming the role of this critic, as you say, you are presenting the role of the judge of value. Okay? Since we have literary criticism as a sort of judgment. Okay, so it's a sort of judgment, and this man who is supposed to pronounce that judgment is supposed to be judge. Okay, and judge of what? Value, and that value specifically is the literary value. Okay, another definitions, if you remember, I told you about the definitions of Edmund Goss when we said that criticism is published analysis of the qualities. And okay, this public analysis and try to concentrate or try to highlight this idea, published analysis. As you say, that activity should be published, should be in a written form. Okay, should be in a written form. Okay, that's it. So criticism for him is the published analysis of the qualities. Said, very good. And the characteristics of a work in literature or fine art. That's it. So, according to Edmund Goss, this idea of the written form of literary criticism should be highlighted. So, this literary criticism nature for him should be in an orthographic form. That's to say, it should be written text. So it's a published analysis of the qualities, by the way, the qualities and the characteristics of a work of literature or fine art, and try to think deeply about the idea of fine art. They say this is a wider scope rather than just only a piece of work of literature. So fine art يعني كمان دخل فيها نقطة الفنون الجميلة أو الفن الجميل، أي مكون من مكونات الفن الجميل. Okay, so set. What else? We have also the definition of Matthew Arnold. Okay, Matthew Arnold is a great critic, Victorian critic, by the way, and he has a definition of literary criticism as a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that's known and thought in the world. Because according to him, the practice of literary criticism is supposed to judge the idea of perfection, as Matthew Arnold believes that the classic literature of the Greek and Roman is the embodiment of perfection. Okay, and if you assume the role of literary critic, that's to say you are judging that perfection representation. Okay, so according to him, criticism is disinterested endeavor. Okay, so this is the attempt, the disinterested attempt to learn and propagate, to learn, so to acquire, propagate, to spread the best that is known and thought in the world. That's to say, so you are supposed to delve in the masterpieces of humanity. So the best thing is known, the best ever known, the best ever thought in the world. Okay? Very good. Done. Walter Beta, a great critic of aestheticism, by the way, he said that to feel the virtue of the poet or the painter. And let's see. Now we have the art, the fine art is included too within the literary work, within the criticism. So to feel the virtue of the poet or the painter, to disengage it and to set it forth are the three stages of the critic duties. So what is this definition mainly concerned with? This is to highlight the stages of the literary work. So the literary work, according to Walter Beta, first of all, should feel the virtue of the poet or the painter. Just to say, should have the experience of that poet or that painter. Should feel that, it has to say, that feeling of pleasure that should be with the painter, the original painter, the original writer, orator of that poet. Okay, so the first of all, to feel that virtue. Number two, to disengage that. So that you say, not to be possessed with that pleasure or that idea or principles, in order not to affect your objectivity in judging that work. So you should be objective. So you should be above the prejudices and the predilections, by the way. So first of all, to feel the virtue. Number two, to disengage it in order not to be biased by being affected by it. And number three, to set it forth, that is to say, to let it spread and go on to make or reach something general or universal. All of these three stages are supposed, according to Walter Beta, the three stages of the critic's duty. They should say the duty of a critic, according to Walter Beta, is supposed to be arranged in these three major steps. Okay, that's it. Of course, you have a set of definitions, might be 17 or 15. Of course, all of these definitions are settled or hung around the idea of practicing judgment, the idea of recognizing the role of that critic or the scope of these literary criticism or that practice of literary criticism. We have two definitions for literary criticism, one of T.S. Eliot and another by the same critic, T.S. Eliot himself. So in one of his definitions, he said criticism is a commentation and exposition of works, art by means of written words. Once again, if you remember Edmund Goss, when he said that published analysis. Now we have the same idea of T.S. Eliot highlighting the idea of being written form. So, according to T.S. Eliot, literary criticism or criticism is a sort of commentation. That's a sort of commentary and exposition of the works of art by means of written form or written words. As I say, you're having your comments and you're having your commentary upon thoroughly of a given literary work, and that, according to T.S. Eliot, is a literary criticism of that work. The end of criticism. Now we have T.S. Eliot himself to say that the end of literary criticism or criticism is elucidation of work of art and the correction of taste. So to say, now we have the function of the work of literary criticism. The function of literary criticism, according to T.S. Eliot, is to the correction or the sort of elucidation of the work, elucidation, to make the promotion of that literary work, and to correct the taste of the masses or the public. Okay, so the function of literary criticism for T.S. Eliot is supposed to be the elucidation of works of literature and the correction of a taste. That's it. Of course, all these definitions are very good and they are valid. One definition which is worth mentioning is that of Spingarn, which is in which he said the sole task of criticism. This also highlights the idea of the function or the task of literary criticism. The sole task of criticism is to answer three questions. So to say, the duty of a literary critic is supposed to answer these three questions, or the function of literary criticism is to answer these three questions. Number one, what has the artist tries to express? So, what's the message of that artist? What's the message of that author or that writer? Number two, how has he succeeded in expressing it? Oh, to what extent that writer or that artist or that author succeeded in expressing that message? Okay, was it worth expressing that? The third question. So Spingarn, in his definition of literary criticism, identified the three questions about any given literary work which is supposed to be answered by that literary critic. Number one, the sole task of, as I told you, this is the definition of Spingarn for literary criticism. The sole task of literary criticism is to answer the three questions. Number one, what has the artist tried to express? How has he succeeded in expressing it? Or was it worth expressing? These are the three questions that any given literary critic should answer in his evaluation or gauging or assessing that literary criticism. Of course, all of these questions, all of these points of view about literary criticism, particular or closely related to its author or that who created that definition. And these, of course, are varied definitions. They are not one definition. They are not fixed one definition. And of course, that could be attributed for three major factors. These three major factors are, number one, personal composition, which is supposed to be that every literary critic who created one of these previous different definitions has its unique personal composition. That is to say, every one of them is composed differently from the others. So to say, every literary critic of these literary critics has its own likes, his own dislikes, his own predilections, his own prejudices, and so that's to say, every one of them has his own different point of view. Okay, they are not all alike, and that's what makes them different in their perception of the nature of literary criticism. They are not the same in recognizing literary criticism nature, literary criticism function, literary criticism practice. Okay, they are different, and that's why it makes them different in the definitions of literary criticism. So all of them are different in literary criticism definition because, number one, the first reason behind attributing all these very different literary criticism definitions is personal composition. Number two, because literary criticism, the theory of literary criticism are closely connected or related or associated with the theory of poetry. And I told you before that poetry is seen differently along history. And if you think about the first perception of poetry by Plato, the first thinker and philosopher of language and literature, he thought negatively about poetry. And so about the function of poetry, the role could be played within his utopian republic and so on. So this is negatively affected the perception of literary criticism as well as poetry for Plato. Unlike Plato, we have the different points of view for Aristotle, of course, which is seen positively, and so on in different times and different ages, as I told you. So why should we have all these different definitions of literary criticism? Because they are actually closely related with the perception of the theory of poetry and the different forms of poetry. So poetry for Plato is unlike the perception of poetry for Aristotle, unlike the perception of poetry for the classics, for the new classics, for the aestheticism, for the Victorian, for the new critic, for the new historicism, and so on. All these different approaches of literary criticism perceives the nature of poetry differently. Okay, that's it. The third reason behind these definitions or varied definitions is because literary criticism theories is closely associated with the spirit of the age. That is to say, every age, every time is characterized with certain theories. These theories could be biological theories, like Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, and as we have the Charles Darwinism and the naturalism and many schools in literature affected by such biology domain of science. Okay, so the theory of evolution in biology affected literary criticism in showing or in the emergence of theories in literature like that of Darwin, social Darwinism and naturalism and so on. Also, the theories of psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, Carl August Jung, and Bergson, other Jacques Lacan, and so on. All of these theories in the domain of psychology affected literary criticism by the appearance of psychoanalysis and how the characters within a given literary work, as well as the author himself, psyche, could be a reflection of different complicated psychological complexes. Okay, and in this way, I could understand how literature mirrors, reflects the society with its own changes, with its own theories, with its own intellectual attitudes. Okay, also the theory of Marx, Karl Marx, in the economics. So we have it reflected in the Marxist criticism or sociological criticism as we have known before. Okay, so these three major factors are the factors to which we could attribute the varied definitions of literary criticism in literature. Okay, so why should we have all these different varied literary criticism? For these, or they could be the reasons behind these varied definition of the variety of definitions. So to these three major factors, I could attribute these varied definitions. So that's it. Very good. As you see, along history, we have the changing role of literary critic. So unlike the utilitarian perception of poets or of poetry from Plato to that of Aristotle, to that of Romanticism, and to that of New Critic, and to that of Russian formalism. Along history, we have different role of a literary critic. So, as I told you, that the history with its different intellectual perceptions, with different theories, with different attitudes, have a different form of literary criticism, as well as different function. So according to each stage, each phase of these different phases, we have a different role for literary critic. Okay, as I said, very good. So if we are shocked with the idea of that, the role of literary critic is supposed to differ from one to one and from time to time, does it mean that we don't have certain principles, rules, canon, formula for judging the work of literary criticism? Does it mean that everyone would say everything in every place? Of course not. Why? Because everything should have roles, everything should have criteria for practicing that type of judgment. So this what's known as principles of literary criticism. So the principles of literary criticism is that criteria, these rules or these canons that should be applied in the practice of literary criticism or practice of judgment. Okay? Of course, these are the principles of literary criticism. We have three principles of literary criticism. And as you see, principles of literary criticism is supposed to deal with the matter, the manner, and the capacity. Or they are supposed to deal with the text and the form and the morality or the message of a given literary work. So the first one of these principles of literary criticism is symmetry. So symmetry here means either the cohesion and coherence of a work of literature, that is, say, a literary critic should think about the cohesion and coherence of a literary given work. And that cohesion and coherence is supposed to be the outcome of the logical arrangement of these different parts of a literary work. That is, say, you should think about literary work as an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So you couldn't have literary work as one part to be a conclusion, without a body, without an introduction. And at the same time, symmetry means something else rather than being the organic unity or to achieve the organic unity between the different parts of literary criticism. Symmetry means a proportional representation of each part of these parts. That is, say, you should think about these parts in a proportional representation. That's to say, you shouldn't think about these different parts illogically. What does it mean? This means that these parts are supposed to be varied in the size. So, for example, for a human being, you are not expecting a human being with very long arm and very short other. That is to say, you shouldn't have very big head and very small belly. Okay, because each part of these parts, parts of a human body should be proportionally represented. As I say, each part should have its proper size. So you are not expecting to have the introduction as big as the body of a given literary work, of course not, or the conclusion as well as the body in the size, of course not. Why? Because we are supposed to think about the human body. The head is less in the size than the body, and the legs are same equal length. The arms are same equal length and size, and so on. So this is the idea of proportional representation of each part of a given literary work. So once again, symmetry is the first principle of literary criticism that should be taken care of during the practice of judging a given literary work. Should have symmetry, and symmetry, as I told you, should have the organic unity by the logical arrangement of these parts of, or these components of a given literary work. Another point of view about symmetry is each part in these logically arranged parts should be proportionally represented well. That is to say, each part should be of its proper size and its proper length. Okay, very good. The next principle of literary criticism is the truth. What is the meaning of truth? Actually, truth means it's not the logical truth or scientific truth. It has nothing to do with scientific truth, by the way, but truth here means the truth of human experience. What does it mean? This means that a human experience should be reflected within a given literary work. How? How could it be? Because any given literary work, in order to be touching for a human being, it should reflect a human experience. It should be something, it's not 100% totally imaginative. It should be something relating to human being, to life, to experience, to the emotion, to the feeling of a human being. And that's what's meant by truth. So if I ask you in the MCQ question that the second principle of literary criticism, truth, and it's equal to the scientific truth, is it true or false? Of course, it would be false. Why? Because here, when I mention the word truth, I don't mean the logical, or I don't mean the scientific truth. No, but here I mean the truth of human experience. So, any given literary work, in order to be judged well, it should reflect an experience of human experience. It should be a reflection of a human experience. So the word the truth here is the truth of the human experience. Very good. Okay, what's next? The third principle of literary criticism is the idealization. What's the meaning of idealization? Idealization means that whenever I judge a given literary work, I should bear in mind, I should think deeply about that literature is basically meant for pleasure. So literature actually is not a historical book. So in giving an account of judging a literary work, I should deeply think about it in the idea of this literary work is meant for pleasure. First and foremost, it's meant for pleasure. And this means that you as an author or as a writer or as an artist shouldn't shock your audience feeling, emotions by either violence or incest. That is said, you shouldn't be bluntly, as a reader or as audience, exposed to violent scenes, okay, or vicious scenes like that, dealing with the intimate relationship between a male and female. Why? Because this is a literary work. It's not a historical book that telling a factual action. Literature is meant for amazement. It's meant for pleasure. is meant for entertainment, not meant for shocking you with these historical facts. So the idea of idealization that a given literary work should take care of, that you are supposed to take care of your audience feeling, emotion, sensation, and consideration. Why? Because literature is meant for entertainment. It's basically meant for a pleasure, for enjoyment, rather than for shocking by scenes of violence, incest, sexual relationship, and so on. Okay? So this is the third principle of literary criticism. So whenever we have different forms of the function of literary criticism, we have different perceptions of literary criticism according to the time in which this perception is acquired or acquainted. Yet we have certain basic rules, canons, formulae to be adopted while you are assuming the role of literary critic, and these are the principles of literary criticism as I let you see them on the screen now. The first principle, symmetry. The second is truth. The third is idealization. So all these three principles should be taken care of while you are doing the work of literary criticism in order not to evade into nonsense work. Okay? That's it. The last thing is to think this semester, or this lecture, is the qualifications of a literary critic, of a good literary critic. So, if we settled the principles of the literary work, so it's more probably to think about what are the qualifications of a given literary work. Actually, we have 6 qualifications for the good literary critic, as we discussed before. Okay, first of all, you should think about literary critic as being an exceptionally gifted and qualified individual. Why? Because the literary critic is supposed to be a highly sensitive man. So it's not every man could be a literary critic. Why? Because he should be well acquainted with certain merits, certain characteristics, certain features that make him suitable for pronouncing the right or the correct judgment within the domain of literary criticism. So first of all, you should think, or should bear in mind that literary critic should be exceptionally a qualified, gifted individual. And of course, this represented by these 6 characteristics or qualifications of literary criticism. Number 1, he must be a man of rare organic sensibility, as well as a man of sound common sense, a man of understanding taste. What does it mean? This means that this highly organic sensibility, as I told you, it should be so delicate, so sensitive for these aesthetic elements of literary criticism, of literature. They say this literary critic should be highly sensitive for these elements of beauty within literature, in order to recognize them, in order to underline them, in order to underscore these elements. So, unless he be a man of highly organic sensibilities, he wouldn't be able to do this. Also, he should have a sound common sense to recognize the ideas, the feelings, the virtues within a given literary work. Also, he should have the understanding taste. So to have all these qualifications make him very, very skillful literary critic, as well as clear thinking. He should have the clear thinking to think deeply about these dormant meaning within a given literary work. Number 2, secondly, a literary critic must be a man of wide reading, not only in literature of his own language, but in as many languages as possible. And according to T.S. Eliot, that point, he regards the whole literature or the whole tradition of Europe is one tradition, by the way. The whole literature of Europe, starting from the Greek up till this moment, according to this T.S. Eliot, this is one tradition, by the way, from Homer down to this time. Okay, so according to T.S. Eliot, all of Europe literature is one tradition, by the way. So regarded those two different languages, by the way. Okay, so literary critic, in order to be a god or a well-qualified literary critic, must be a man of wide reading, not only in the literature of his own language, but in as many languages as possible. Okay, very good, well done. Number three, or thirdly, number three. A literary critic, of course, must have the proper training and technical skill in the different branches of literature. Of course, he must have that proper training and must have these technical skill in those different branches of literature. And as I told you, literature, literary genres in another different video, starting from that of poetry and drama, fiction, with its two subcategories of novel and short story, and literary criticism and literary theory. Besides the new genres like fiction genres, non-fiction genres, the films and movies and so on. All of these should, the literary critic should have that proper training as well as that technical skills in these different branches of literature. And of course, such a skill and such a training should be acquired only through the hard and prolonged labor and study. So as I say, such a skill or such a technical skill and such proper training couldn't be achieved unless I have that hard and prolonged study and labor. That you say, by means of hard labor, by means of prolonged labor, by means of hard study, by means of prolonged study, I could only achieve this technical skills and that proper training that enable me to be good and skillful in all different branches of literature. Very good. Number four, or fourthly, a literary critic must have, must rise above all prejudices and predilections. That's to say, a literary critic must be an objective man. He must be in the side of objectivity rather than the subjectivity. So he must rise above these predilections and prejudices. Whether he like or whether he dislike someone, it shouldn't affect his judgment upon his or her literary work. Okay? Whether these predilections or prejudices, personal, religious, or literary, or politically, or nationally, or even literary, okay? So these, okay, predilections or prejudices, whether on the level of personal or religious or national, political, or even literary, shouldn't affect your judgment of a given literary work. So, of course, prejudices come in the way of the proper, correct judgment, as well as that subjectivity or that predilections. So as well as prejudices, as well as predilections, by the way, what affect the objectivity of your proper judgment of a given literary work. Okay, number 5, a good literary critic must have what's known as imaginative sympathy. What's mean of imaginative sympathy? Imaginative sympathy is to assume the role or the position or to put yourself in the shoes of the writer or the author himself. And of course, doing this makes you feel the way the author felt and to think the way the author or the original author thought. So this would help you profoundly to understand the position, the stand from which that author, that writer do or felt or think in this way. Okay, so number 5 or fifthly, the good literary critic must have imaginative sympathy that would enable to make him put himself in the shoes of the writer or the author or the artist, to think the way he thought, to feel the way he felt, and so on. Okay, this would help him fully understand his work, fully understand his message, fully understand his aim of that literary work. The last thing, or the last qualification of a good literary critic, is number 6. The critic or the good critic must be a person, or must be the person of a good knowledge of human psychology. That is to say, a literary critic must be have this sound knowledge of human psychology. Why should have that sound knowledge of human psychology? Of course, this to help him fully understand the mentality of the writer as well as its characters. Okay, so if he fully understands the mentality, the way the writer thinks, the way the writer feels, the way the writer believes, okay, this would help to fully understand his goals, his objective, his message, and how he functionalized the literary devices to carry out these objectives or these aims, of course. Okay, the human psychology is very, very, very important for the work of literary criticism, by the way, because you need them on 2 levels of analysis. On the level of the authorial analysis, when you think about the author himself, and the way the author thinks, the way the author feels, the way the author intends to convey meaning for us as audience, okay, as well as the sub-level of the characters within a given literary work. Such sound knowledge of human psychology would help you to fully understand the literature itself, as well as the society, because literature is supposed to mirror society. So literature is supposed to mirror society, and in its turn is supposed to affect society as well as being affected by society itself, because literature is a product of its time and place. And being a product of that time and place, it has the power to influence that time and space in its turn. Okay? I think that we should stop here. And inshallah, next time we'll explain the part of the different types of literary criticism. Until we meet again, thank you very much, and hope you all the best. Thank you. Do you have any questions? By the end of this lecture, do you have any questions, please? Does anyone have any questions? If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much. Okay, see you inshallah next time. Goodbye.